Hello and welcome to Lesson 2 of How Did the United States Careen Towards Civil War? In Lesson 1 we learned about the differences between the North and the South, and we also learned about the Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850. Today we're going to focus on some other events that occurred leading up to the Civil War that led America to the point where the Civil War could no longer be avoided. And our first topic today is what was nullification and what does states' rights mean? Nullification was one of our vocabulary words, and of course nullification means when a state decides that it is not going to enforce a federal or a national law within its boundaries. In 1828 and 1832, the federal government, which is our national government in Washington, D.C., passed a tariff on imported British goods. And tariff was also a vocabulary word back at the beginning of the semester, and a tariff is a tax on things brought into the country. And import is a word that means to bring things into the country from outside the country. So there was a tariff on things brought in from Great Britain, a tax. South Carolina hated this tariff because it hurt them economically, and so the state government basically voted to say, hey, within the borders of South Carolina, we are not going to collect this tax, and we are not going to pay this tariff. That was a pretty bold move because in our system of government, the federal government is the highest and the most powerful level of government. South Carolina believed that it could make this choice to not enforce a federal law within its borders because it believes that states had rights. And this goes to the whole debate that occurred at the Constitutional Convention: who's more powerful, the states or the federal government? The states' rights side, the anti-federalist side, believed that states should hold the balance of power and be stronger than the federal government in Washington, D.C. John C. Calhoun, who was the Vice President of the United States under Andrew Jackson, was the leader of the nullification states' rights side. And John C. Calhoun was the Vice President under Andrew Jackson, who was famous for the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears. So if that rings a bell for you from your social studies analysis, it should. He resigned as vice president to protest the federal tariff. From his perspective, he was vice president over a system that was enforcing something he didn't believe in, so he resigned to show his protest over that issue. Andrew Jackson and the national government threatened to enforce the tariff with the U.S. military. And Andrew Jackson himself was not a big fan of the tariff, but he recognized that as president of the country, if he didn't stand up to enforce federal laws, then those laws didn't amount to very much. So that was kind of an issue for Mr. Jackson. Faced with the threat of military force, South Carolina decided to back down, but that did not mean that they weren't still very unhappy with the tariff. The next event that is part of the sequence of events that led to the Civil War was known as Bleeding Kansas. This is a very sad tale in the history of the country. In 1854, the Missouri Compromise, which is also known as the Compromise of 1820, was repealed. And as you know, that's a vocabulary word that means the law was canceled or taken away. And a new law was passed called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And this kind of laid the groundwork for some serious conflict. Stephen A. Douglas was a senator from Illinois, and he proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And basically what it did is allowed Kansas and Nebraska to vote for whether or not they wanted slavery. So just like with the Compromise of 1850 and the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory, Kansas and Nebraska territories were going to be allowed to vote once they had enough citizens for whether they did or did not want slavery. And that idea is called popular sovereignty, the idea that you can vote for what you want. So the North saw this as a giveaway to the South. They said, why are we giving up the rights we had, because these are areas that are north of the Mason-Dixon line. They should not be open to slavery. And basically, we're throwing away what we won in the Compromise of 1820 to make the South happy again. The South is like the spoiled, rotten brother or sister who always gets what they want because they cry all the time. And that's kind of how the North looked at the South at this point. So pro and anti-slave groups flocked to the area. They moved into Kansas and Nebraska as fast as they could to literally fight for the land. And often, this was very violent. So just envision a lawless territory where people are moving into it as fast as they can to decide whether or not it is or is not going to be a slave or free area. And of course, you can probably figure out that if they're not resolving these issues peacefully, that they might resolve it something other than peacefully. Then the Supreme Court got involved with something called the Dred Scott decision of 1857. And this kind of poured gasoline on the fires that were rupturing between the North and the South. Dred Scott was a slave who was born in Virginia, and Virginia was a slave state. However, over time, his owner moved around, and at one point moved him to many different free states, including Illinois and Wisconsin. So this begged the question, if your owner moves you from a state that allows slavery to a free state, are you still a slave, or does living in a free state make you free? When Dred Scott's owner died, he sued for his freedom in court, claiming that since he had lived in free states, he should be free. And he had many important abolitionist lawyers who were willing to help him out. And remember, abolitionists are people who wanted to get rid of slavery. So the Supreme Court eventually issued a ruling. The gentleman you see on the right there was Chief Justice Taney of the Supreme Court. He has a lovely statue of him on the grounds of the Maryland State Capitol. And in 1857, the court ruled that slaves, since they were not citizens, because they were not considered people, therefore were not protected by the Constitution, and therefore did not have the right to even sue in court for their freedom. They were basically considered property, or I hate to put it in these terms, they were considered animals, or given the same legal rights as animals, which these days we would look at as pretty disgusting. But back in those days, the Southerners were quite happy with this decision. It was very controversial. The North was outraged, and the South felt like, okay, we can stay part of the country because at least the Supreme Court is on our side. So that can that we're kicking down the road, we're not able to kick it as far down the road anymore. This is 1857, and the Civil War started in 1861. Then there was a guy by the name of John Brown, and he is famous for what is known as Brown's Raid. What was Brown's Raid? Well, John Brown was a radical abolitionist who was quite hirsute, as you can see. Hirsute is a word meaning having lots of hair, the opposite of Mr. Blumendahl. He wanted to start a slave rebellion in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He thought if he could help the slaves fight back, that they would fight back against their masters and start a rebellion. So in October of 1959, which should actually be October of 1859, he and a group of fellow abolitionists raided a weapons depot in order to arm the slaves. He was going to steal guns from the federal government, give those guns to the slaves, and his hope was that the slaves would fight back against their masters. The raid lasted for 3 days and was eventually put down by General Robert E. Lee, who would later be a famous Civil War general. So Brown was not successful. He was captured, and later he was made an example of. He was put on trial. He was very dramatic in his trial, arguing for the abolitionist case, and Southerners wanted him put to death. And so he was executed for instituting this raid. And the Southerners were like, dude, if we've got people in the North who are willing to break into federal weapons depots and give guns to the slaves, we cannot stay part of the country much longer. The South was terrified. So then there was an election in 1860, and it was definitely one of our more interesting elections. Not just because of who won, but because of who was on the ballot and how many people were on the ballot. And as you can see there are 4 pictures, so that can tell you what this might have looked like. In the election of 1860, the feelings over slavery had reached a fever pitch. This was an issue that was huge, and basically the entire election was going to be fought over. It was a 4-way race, which allowed a Northerner to win for the first time in years. One of the reasons the South had stayed in the Union is because they were successful in electing presidents from the South who would look out for Southern interests. This time, didn't work out that way. Because the vote was split between 4 different candidates, Abraham Lincoln was able to become the first Republican ever elected president, and he was able to win a majority in the Electoral College, winning only states in the North, which had larger populations, and Oregon and California also voted for Abraham Lincoln. His views on slavery and keeping the Union together were very frightening to the South, so much so that he was not even allowed to appear on the ballot in southern states. So in these states down here that voted for Breckinridge, Abraham Lincoln's name was not even on the ballot. They did not even have him as a choice in the election. Between the time Abraham Lincoln was elected and the time he took office on March 4th, 1861, Mr. Blumenthal's birthday, the southern states had seceded. At least many of them did. Seceded means they said, we are no longer part of the United States. We are going to form our own country called the Confederate States of America, and we are not even going to think about serving or being a part of the United States under the leadership of President Lincoln. And this, of course, set the stage for the Civil War, because then the Confederate States faced off against what was then called the Union, the northern states, and all the chips were on the table. This is a county-by-county breakdown of who voted for president in each county in America in the 1860 election. And notice, it's pretty distinct. Pretty distinct. And Marion County, where we live, actually voted for Stephen A. Douglas, for what that's worth for you. So, the stage is now set for the Civil War itself, and that will be part of another lesson. But for now, please write a summary of what you learned in today's lesson at the bottom of your Cornell notes. And we are now ready to learn about the Civil War. This is Mr. Blumendahl, signing off once again.